Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light. Keep us forever in thy path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
On behalf of Harvard University President Drew Gilpin Faust, Mr. Glenn Hutchins, and Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr., it is my honor to welcome the 2013 Du Bois medalists. Let us now, as a collective body, both appeal to and affirm a spirit of excellence. Affirm this spirit of excellence in the arts, education, and all fields of human endeavor by hearing the words of William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. We ask you, O God, to bless all schools and forward the great work of education for which we all stand. Arouse within us and within our land a deep realization of the seriousness of our task. Give us the grace to realize that education is not simply doing the things we like, studying the tasks that appeal to us, or wandering in the world of thought. But rather, it is often the unpleasant task, the hard lesson, and the bitter experience that often leads us to knowledge, to power, and to the good. Help us to realize how heavy is our responsibility and how great is the cost. For the school of today is the world of tomorrow. Help us, O God, to seek thy truth, as it is this truth that makes us free. And this is why we linger here to learn. May we all say together, amen. Professor Gates.
Thank you, buddy. That was great. Good afternoon, everyone. God, what a voice Jonathan has. And I would be bad if I had that voice. Give it up for Jonathan Walton, please. Now, as you can see from the medalists assembled on the stage, we're missing two of our honorands this afternoon, Valerie, Jarrett, and John Lewis. 50 cents to anyone who guesses why. Now, it's one thing for the Republican fringe to shut down the government. It's quite another for them to interrupt this ceremony. But we're not going to let Republican dysfunction, government dysfunction, stand in the way of celebrating these 6 great individuals' achievements. So please give it up once again for our 6 2013 Du Bois medalists. President Faust, Glenn Hutchins, we've gathered here today at Sanders Theater for a double celebration. First, to honor 6 women and men with the Du Bois Medal, which is Harvard's highest honor for outstanding contributions to African and African-American society and culture. And second, to announce the birth of the 25th member of the Harvard Community of Academic Research Centers, the Hutchins Center for African and African-American Research, and to thank the person who has made this great event possible, a person whose unmatched generosity is as nourishing and as steady as his vision is far-reaching and expansive, and I'm talking about my friend, Glenn H. Hutchins. Glenn and I thought that the most appropriate setting for this milestone ceremony should be Sanders Theater, and encasing it, Memorial Hall. Why? Over a century ago, Sanders Theater was the stage for 2 seminal events in the history of black people at Harvard. It was the site at which W.E.B. Du Bois delivered his commencement oration in 1890 on the theme, of all things, of Jefferson Davis as a representative of civilization. Surely a most remarkable act of sublime magnanimity and cosmopolitan objectivity, the rhetorical cleverness of which could not have been lost on the journalist who reported on Du Bois's speech for the New York Times the very next day. And just 6 years later, also on this very stage, the university would award its first honorary degree to a black person, to the Venerable Booker T. Washington, who would soon, as these things go, become Du Bois's nemesis in the black political landscape. This stage within Memorial Hall, so close to Annenberg Hall, where a striking marble bust of Du Bois is permanently located, also calls to mind, ladies and gentlemen, the 1,400 Harvard men who enlisted in the Union cause during the Civil War, especially the 176 men who died, among them most famously Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who led the 54th Massachusetts Regiment of Glory fame, which included two of Frederick Douglass's sons, Lewis and Charles, as well as residents of Du Bois's hometown, Great Barrington, in the western part of the Commonwealth. Those men, whose names are inscribed in the transept as you entered, are also inscribed in our thoughts today, as they were in Booker T. Washington's thoughts at the Honorees dinner following the awarding of his degree, when he proclaimed, and I'm quoting, "If through me, 7 million of my people in the South might be permitted to send a message to Harvard, that message would be, tell them that their sacrifice was not in vain." So yes, it is altogether fitting and proper, to paraphrase Lincoln at Gettysburg, that this historic departure we commemorate today be held in this august space, which has such enormous symbolic import to the African American people, to our great university, and to American history as a whole. Before we celebrate the contributions and accomplishments of our guests here on the stage, and before Glenn introduces you to the contours and design of the new Hutchins Center, I ask all of us to pause for a few minutes and reflect upon how we arrived at this auspicious moment, and to say a few words of thanks for those who brought us to this place. Two of my favorite lines from the Black tradition are, "We've come this far by faith, and we've not come this far alone." Think of these two phrases as our text for today, as our departed friend, the Reverend Peter J. Gomes, might have put it. Never were truer words spoken about the history of Black people here at Harvard, except perhaps, and quite unconsciously, in the climax of the first verse of our alma mater, Fair Harvard. Calm, rising through change and through storm. It's a most complex history, these changes, these storms, this calm rising, replete with ebbs and flows. A history we would do well to acknowledge, all the more thoroughly to appreciate how very far we have to be thankful, how very much we have to be thankful for at this ceremony this afternoon. While the charter of the president and fellows of Harvard College, dated May 31st, 1650, endorsed, and I quote, "education in knowledge and godliness," the founders couldn't envision the embrace of the new college extended to the sons of the colony's African slaves and indentured servants. In fact, there would be no graduates of Harvard College for its first 234 years. To put this in perspective, that would be the same as having no Black graduates from now until the year 2247. Considering that two of Harvard's early presidents, Increase Mather and Benjamin Wadsworth, owned slaves themselves, considering the fact that the first Black student would not be admitted to Harvard until Beverly Garnett Williams in the year 1847, considering the fact that the first 3 Black men admitted to the Harvard Medical School in 1850, Isaac Snowden, Daniel Lang Jr., and Martin R. Delaney, the father of Black nationalism, were forced to withdraw after 1 semester because of a vocal and powerful minority who deemed their presence, as they put it, distasteful and injurious. And considering the fact that in that same year, 1850, Louis Agassiz, Harvard's distinguished professor of zoology and geology, called Black people a separate race, he said, when viewed zoologically, and warned that Americans should, and I quote, "beware of how we give to the Blacks rights, by virtue of which they may endanger the progress of whites." We can begin to understand, considering these things, how very far Fair Harvard has come in terms of race relations, and why I say that we've come this far by faith. But Harvard always represents potential, as that devoted Harvard man, the great historian John Morton Blum, was fond of reminding me during my undergraduate days back at Yale, where he served as my mentor in the history department. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, Harvard did do better. Modestly at first, hiring a man called A. Molyneux Hewlett as superintendent of the Harvard College Gymnasium and gym teacher in 1851, and then by graduating 3 black men, all firsts, from its professional schools in 1869. Just 4 years following the end of the Civil War, and 1 year after the reunited states ratified the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection of the laws, Edwin Clarence Joseph Turpin Howard at the medical school, George L. Ruffin at the law school, and Robert T. Freeman at the dental school fulfilled the long-denied promise of equal opportunity at Harvard for black men. They were followed a year later by Richard T. Greener, who in 1870 became the first black man actually to graduate from Harvard College, winning the chief prizes in writing and speaking along the way, as our colleague Werner Solers and Caldwell Titcomb and Thomas Underwood put it in their wonderful study of the history of black people at Harvard. Alberta Virginia Scott would become the first black graduate of Radcliffe in 1898, and Plenyono Wolo, a Liberian, would become the first African graduate in 1917. In 1872, 2 years after Greener received his A.B. degree, George Franklin Grant, M.D., became the university's first black faculty member when he was appointed demonstrator instructor at the dental school, with President Charles Eliot himself as one of his patients. With the triumph of these pioneers against the greatest of odds, the black presence of Harvard was launched, and it was here to stay. Why Harvard? Why was it important for black people to matriculate at Harvard? Why was it important for them to pursue their dreams of enlightenment here in Cambridge? In a speech at the Harvard Club of New York in 1883, Richard Greener attributed his desire for pursuing his undergraduate education here to, quote, the traditions, the patriotic record, and the scholarly attainments of her alumni. Not one of the humblest of her children, he continued, who has felt the touch of her pure spirit or enjoyed the benefits of her culture, can fail to remember what she expects of her sons wherever they may be: to stand fast for good government, to maintain the right, to uphold honesty and character, to be, if nothing else, good citizens, to perform to the extent of their ability every duty assumed or imposed upon them, democratic in their aristocracy, Catholic in their liberality, impartial in their judgment, and uncompromising in their convictions of duty. Why was it important for black women and men to integrate Harvard despite its costs? And ladies and gentlemen, costs there were, both psychological and emotional. Precisely because of the scandalous claim that Americans of African descent were not intellectually equal to Americans of European descent, a difference supposedly programmed and dictated by biology, by nature. As Arthur Schomburg put it, the Negro has been a man without a history because he's been considered a man without a worthy culture. Carter G. Woodson, the second black man after Du Bois to earn a PhD here in history, elaborated upon this idea, stressing the urgency with which this challenge, the root of racism, must be met head on. And I quote, if you are unable to demonstrate to the world that you have a history, a record, the world will say to you, you are not worthy to enjoy the blessings of democracy or anything else. They will say to you, who are you anyway? Your ancestors have never controlled empires or kingdoms, and most of your race have contributed little or nothing to science or philosophy and mathematics. In history, of course, he continues, the Negro had no place in the curriculum. He was pictured as a human being of the lower order, unable to subject passion to reason, and therefore useful only when made the hewer of wood and the drawer of water for others. And if this libel against the people of African descent, the daughters and sons of the slaves, was to be refuted, where better, ladies and gentlemen, where more strategic to stage this battle than at Harvard? for all of the reasons that Richard T. Greener claimed. After 2 centuries of change and storm, black men and women were beginning to rise in class, in the library, at commencement exercises, literally degree by degree. And if Harvard was ever going to rise up with them, from a gentleman's training school to a research university on a par with the best in the world, it needed them too. Ability, character, and merit. These are the sole passports to her favor, Greener had told his fellow alumni. Veritas, the purest pursuit of knowledge and truth, wherever it led, demanded the best minds, regardless of the skin color, encasing those minds. President Eliot, right here on this stage, at the dedication of Memorial Hall in 1878, understood this. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hired Dr. Grant on the faculty in the first place and then sought him out for his own dental care. Believe me, nobody chooses their dentist to make a political statement, especially not in the 19th century. Nor would he have affixed his signature to that first diploma from the college at the end of his first year in office. At no school or department at the Harvard that Charles Eliot was transforming did black people meet this challenge more brilliantly than in the history department, starting with a man in whose memory we honor the 6 august individuals today. First came W.E.B. Du Bois, whose heart, he writes, was set on Harvard. Because it was the greatest and oldest college, and I therefore quite naturally thought it was the one I must attend, he states with his charming and inimitable immodesty. I was walking beneath the elms of Harvard, he writes, the name of allurement, the college of my youngest, my wildest visions. Du Bois performed brilliantly, studying with William James and George Santayana and Albert Bushnell Hart, taking first place in the Boylston Oratory competition his senior year, graduating cum laude, and as I have mentioned, speaking on this very stage at his own commencement. Du Bois, like Glenn Hutchins, graduated with 3 degrees from Harvard, the AB, the AM, and the PhD in history, becoming the first black person to earn a doctorate degree at Harvard in any field. Eva B. Dykes would follow 26 years later as the first black female to earn the PhD in English philology. Overall, despite social isolation and social snubs, such as his rejection from the Glee Club because of his race, Du Bois tells us that he enjoyed his time here at Harvard. The Harvard of 1888, he writes, was an extraordinary aggregation of great teachers. Not often since that day have so many distinguished teachers been together in one place and at one time in America. By good fortune, he continues, I was thrown into direct contact with many of these men who eschewed the Jim Crow social conventions of their time and embraced the young Du Bois in that colorblind universe called the quality of the mind. Du Bois would be followed in the history department by a stellar succession of impeccable scholars, including the veritable father of African American history, Carter G. Woodson, who took his PhD in 1912, who had founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, the Journal of Negro History in 1916, and Negro History Week in 1926, followed by Charles Wesley, Rayford Logan, Alrutheus Ambush Taylor, and the great John Hope Franklin in 1941, whose pioneering survey of African American history from slavery to freedom, now thoroughly updated and reissued in a new version by our very own Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, I read as a sophomore back at Yale, and which is one of those books long ago dog-eared and occupying pride of place at my bedside. When we recall that Alain Locke, the proverbial dean of the Harlem Renaissance, earned his PhD in philosophy here at Harvard in 1918, after graduating from the college with honors in 1908 and becoming the first black Rhodes Scholar, and that Benjamin Brawley, County Cullen, and Sterling Brown, also all pillars of the Harlem Renaissance, earned graduate degrees in English at Harvard, and that Charles Hamilton Houston, the architect of the legal strategies that ended de jure segregation, graduated with 2 degrees from the law school in 1922 cum laude and 1923. We can begin to understand that the challenge of combating intellectual racism was met squarely, head-on, in the most brilliant fashion through the performance of black students in the classroom here. Wittingly or unwittingly, in spite of itself or because of itself, Harvard has played a key role both in African American history and in the training of the seminal thinkers who have created and written that extraordinary history. And African Americans have played a key role at Harvard. If gaining admission to Harvard College and its professional schools was one challenge, gaining tenure to the Harvard faculty was quite another and would take much longer. But this challenge too would be met. The first black person to be granted tenure at the university was William Augustus Hinton. Dr. Hinton graduated from the college in 1905 and took the MD degree here in 1912. After serving as an instructor at the medical school beginning in 1918, he was promoted to the rank of clinical professor in 1949, 1 year before his retirement. A year later, the administration of President James Bryant Conant made a spectacular appointment. On April 10, 1950, it appointed Dr. Ralph Bunche as professor of government, 5 months before Bunche received the Nobel Prize for Peace for his role in 1948 and 49 as the UN mediator in the Israeli-Arab dispute over Palestine, and a year after Harvard had awarded him an honorary doctorate degree. Bunche, who himself had earned an AM and PhD from Harvard, was never able to take up his duties as professor because of his duties at the UN. And so, 2 years later, he resigned. It would be another Harvard alum who would become the first black professor to take up tenure in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. On July 1st, 1969, Martin L. Kilson, who had earned the AM in 1958 and the PhD in 1959, made history, ladies and gentlemen, by earning a promotion to full professor in the government department, the same year in which a young man named David Evans, an engineer who had graduated with a master's degree in engineering from Princeton and who was working at IBM, took a leave of absence to help the admissions office recruit more black undergraduates. And he has remained at that admissions office, ensuring diversity with excellence in every undergraduate class entering Harvard since that time. 2 years later, in 1971, 3 more milestones were reached. Preston Williams became the first black person granted tenure in the Divinity School. The late Derrick Bell, whom President Obama called the Rosa Parks of legal education, became the first African American to receive tenure at the law school. And in the sociology department, Orlando Patterson received tenure, incredibly, at the age of 31. Martin Kilson, David Evans, Orlando Patterson, and Preston Williams, pioneers of the history of black people at Harvard, are with us this afternoon. I ask them to stand and be recognized. So how did we get to this marvelous moment today, ladies and gentlemen, in the history of people of African descent at Harvard? For this, we have to begin by thanking several generations, frankly, of students. In 1922, which we might think of as the high watermark of racism at Harvard, President Abbott Lawrence Lowell signed off on separate but equal in the freshman dorms. Actually, to be honest, black students weren't even allowed to live in the dorms at all, only to be greeted by an outpouring of protest, first by students, then by black alumni like Monroe Trotter and the great Du Bois, so that a year later, the overseers, including Franklin Delano Roosevelt, forced Lowell to back down. Strengthened by the fight, black students formed the Nile Club under the leadership of Charles Hamilton Houston, and they invited the leader of the Back to Africa movement, Marcus Garvey, to campus to speak. The same year, Du Bois also returned for a lecture, both at what was then called the Student Union, now called the Barker Center, currently home to the Department of African and African American Studies. Calm, ladies and gentlemen, rising through change and through storm. 46 years later, on April 19, 1968, the day on which Harvard officially mourned the assassination of Dr. King, members of the Association of African and Afro-American Students, known as AFRO, under the leadership of Jeff Howard, Skip Griffin, and Wes Prophet, protested outside of Memorial Church, issuing 4 requests on Fair Harvard, then under the leadership of President Nathan Pusey. One of these requests was for the creation of a full-fledged Department of Afro-American Studies. Their protests led to the Rosofsky Report, released in January 1969 under the chairmanship of Henry Rosofsky. The report, justly famous throughout the American Academy as a pioneering and clear-sighted blueprint for the institutionalization of an entirely new field of academic inquiry, recommended the creation of a program in African American Studies within the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Henry Rosofsky would go on, of course, to become the long-serving dean of FAS and would play several key roles in the life of the department and the Du Bois Institute, including hiring and then mentoring in the most avuncular manner its current director. The depth of our debt to Henry Rosofsky cannot be gainsaid. But the students held firm for the creation of a full-fledged department, not a program. And on April 22nd, 1969, just 1 year after the initial call for the creation of a department, and in the same year in which Professor Martin Kilson would be granted tenure, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, after intense and often bitter debate, voted to create that new department. One of the members of AFRO's ad hoc committee of black students is on the faculty of the law school today. Her father, Ewart, would be named the first chair of the new department, and she would become the first black woman to be granted tenure at the law school. And that person is our very own Lonnie Guinier. Give it up for Lonnie Guinier, please. Lonnie's lecturing in Delaware, but I wanted to be able to say that you all gave it up for her anyway, so thank you. Not everyone in the administration or on the faculty was pleased about the existence of this new department, to be quite honest. And truth be told, not all of the members of the black faculty agreed about its direction either. And so a group of faculty, among them Martin Kilson, Orlando Patterson, Derek Bell, Preston Williams, and others, helped design a research institute with Walter Leonard, a champion of diversity in higher education, then serving as special assistant to President Derek Bach, before becoming a president himself at Fisk University, which was Du Bois's first undergraduate alma mater. They named the fledgling institute for and in honor of W.E.B. Du Bois. And President Bach and Dean Rosofsky launched it in 1975 in the office of the president, the same year that Eileen Southern became the second chair of the department and the first African-American woman granted tenure in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Preston Williams, the lead author of the Institute's founding document, with collaboration from Daniel Aaron of the English department, was appointed by President Bach as interim director. These two rival organizations were united finally by the appointment of Nathan Huggins in 1980 as the first occupant of the Du Bois Professorship, to head both the department and the Institute. In the tradition inaugurated by Du Bois and Carter Woodson, Professor Huggins had also taken the PhD in history here in 1962 and brought to both of the institutions he headed the full weight of his seminal scholarship and his administrative acumen, including the foresight and wisdom to hire our own Werner Solers as his first appointment as professor of African American literature. Together, the two of them, both full professors in the department, kept the faith and the dream of the students alive during often difficult years for the field as a whole, when resources were painfully scarce. Professor Huggins' untimely death in 1989 led to the initiation of another phase in the history of the department and the Institute, including the appointments of the philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah and me by President Bach and Dean Rosofsky, under the dynamic leadership and unflagging support of President Neil Rudenstein, who actually believed, ladies and gentlemen, that the study of people of African descent should be a fundamental part of a truly liberal arts education, and who did so much to make this moment that we celebrate today possible. Black faculty in FAS and throughout the university saw a dramatic rise in their numbers and their impact, including the appointment of the first black person, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, to be granted tenure in the history department. the appointment of 2 university professors, William Julius Wilson and Cornell West, the appointments of the sociologist Lawrence Douglas Bobo and the anthropologist Marcelina Morgan, who would found the Hip Hop Archive, the appointment of Suzanne Blier as Harvard's first professor of African art, the creation of the nation's first chair in African American music endowed in honor of a jazz musician, the great Quincy Jones, and the appointment of Ingrid Monson to fill it, the creation of a PhD program in the fields of both African and African American studies, among many other milestones. Under President Larry Summers and Dean William Kirby, the FAS made 9 pivotal appointments in the department, including Jim Sedanius' appointment as the first black professor in the psychology department, Evelyn Hammond's appointment as the first black female professor in the history of science department, Claudine Gay's appointment as the first black female professor in the government department, and 4 appointments that ignited our African studies track, including Biodun Jefo, Kofi Agawu, Jacob Alupina, and John Mugani, who created our dynamic program in African languages. These 4 professors joined the historian Emmanuel Champong, promoted to full professor by President Rudenstein in the year 2000, as the first Africans granted tenure in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences since the Nigerian historian Kenneth Dike in 1971. And since they are with us, I would like our African colleagues please to stand up. More recently, led by our exceptionally wise and effective chair, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, the department, with the extraordinarily strong and thoughtful support and encouragement of President Drew Faust, Dean Mike Smith, and Provost Alan Garber, made no less than 12 tenured appointments to the department in the last 7 years, including most recently the university's first appointment in Afro-Latin American Studies, the historian Alejandro de la Fuente, along with the legendary South African anthropologists Jean and John Komarov. At the same time, under the directorship of Caroline Elkins, the Committee on African Studies, building on the key appointments made under President Summers, has been made a national resource center, one of only 12 in African studies in the nation, with a much sought-after Title VI grant. And now, under the chairmanship of the Du Bois Professor of the Social Sciences, Larry Bobo, like Professor Wilson, a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the department is poised to develop its diasporic focus in Afro-Latin American studies and make even more profound inroads in public policy and social science appointments. Would Evelyn, Carrie, and Larry please stand up? Today, ladies and gentlemen, 22 years after President Bok and Dean Rusovsky invested the resources to rebuild the department, which was down to 1 tenured professor in 1990, African and African American Studies boasts 36 tenured professors. It teaches over 1,000 students each year, and it has the largest African language program in the entire world. It's amazing. With the support of a succession of Harvard presidents and FAS deans, including Derek Bok and Henry Rusovsky, Neil Rudenstein and Jeremy Knowles, Larry Summers and William Kirby, Larry's provost, the clear-eyed and innovative Steve Hyman, and now President Faust, Dean Mike Smith, and Provost Alan Garber. We have come so very far by faith and lots of hard work. Since those contentious early days when the fledgling department was so very vulnerable, its future deeply in doubt. This is the path that has led us here to Sanders Theater in Memorial Hall this afternoon, where we have gathered to commemorate another historic milestone, both in the history of the presence of students and professors of African descent and in the study of the history and culture of persons of African descent, since those first 3 graduates back in the year 1869. As I mentioned earlier, Du Bois loved his education, his learning experiences in the classroom and the library here at Harvard. But he regarded it understandably with mixed emotions. In general, he wrote, I asked nothing of Harvard but the tutelage of teachers and the freedom of the laboratory and the library. I was quite voluntarily and willingly outside its social life. Sometimes, he continued, the shadow of insult fell, as when at one reception, a white woman seemed determined to mistake me for a waiter. I was, Du Bois concludes, in Harvard, but not of it, and realized the irony of my singing Fair Harvard. I sang it because I liked the music, and not from any pride in the Pilgrims. A long time had passed between the time of the Pilgrims and Du Bois when he was at Harvard. But this story, our story, feels so much younger, and all the more astounding, ladies and gentlemen, when you consider the remarkable span of Du Bois's life. As a graduate student, he saw Frederick Douglass lecture. He received his PhD in the year of Douglass's death. He left the stage the night before the Great March on Washington, at a time when Barack Obama, Harvard Law, class of 1990, was already walking the earth. As the inheritors, as the caretakers of this story, and the many stories yet to be written, I think it fair to say of our generation that today, President Faust, unquestionably, we are both in Harvard and of it. As the old lyric goes, ever rising through change and through storm. The milestone we mark this afternoon, as glorious as any in the 377-year history of Harvard, has been made possible by the vision and generosity of one person alone, one man rising with us. Because of him, because of his extraordinary generosity, I'm thrilled to share the good news with all of you here, inside this Sanders Theater, this Memorial Hall of Shaw, of Du Bois, of Washington, of Bunch, of countless others from the age that has passed, that change has come to Harvard, but change without storm, only the clear, open, fair skies of what can be for generations to come, in the age that is waiting before. It's said that there are three kinds of people: people who watch what happens, which is, frankly, most of us; people who ask, what happened? Historians and scholars like me; and finally, people who make things happen. We need people who study the world, and we need people who question the world. But we also need people, ladies and gentlemen, who change the world. We need people like Glenn Hutchins, the person whose intelligence is a force multiplier, the person who doesn't just have a vision, but who also has a way to make that vision a reality. There are few, very few, such people. But if you are fortunate to get to know one, it's like having a friend with a magic carpet, a friend who's seen more than you have, a friend who knows how much can be done with resourcefulness and determination, a friend who wants you to test the very boundaries of your own. Don't get me wrong, Glenn Hutchins is not a genie in a bottle. He's more like a genie who owns a majority stake in a few bottle factories. And he comes at nobody's bidding. Most important, he knows how to make amazing dreams come true. I speak for all of us here this afternoon, Glenn, when I say thank you and amen. With your gift of the Hutchins Center of African and African American Research, you have given all of us here, the beneficiaries of your generosity, old Harvard, new Harvard, fair Harvard, and, shall we say, not so fair Harvard, something to remember in this Memorial Hall of sacrifices and firsts, something to remember for all time. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said at the top, we have not come this far alone. We've come this far by faith and with friendship. So please join me in thanking the man who made this day and all future days at the Hutchins Center possible, my dear friend, Glenn H. Hutchins.
Thank you. Okay, that's enough. Thank you. Thank you. Skip, those were wonderful words, and I will use many fewer of them. Now, thank you. Many have asked what the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research actually is and what it will do. We've prepared a video, not quite of Spielberg quality, I guarantee you, but we've prepared a video to explain that to you. But before we show the video, let me give you a brief overview. The center is composed of 9 components. Of course, at the heart of the center will be the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute, which will play a vital role in the future. Another key part of the center is the Cooper Gallery for African and African American Art. And I think the donor, Bert Cooper, is with us today. Where are you, Bert? Stand up. Bravo. Bravo. Bert, you're a real prince. Thank you very much. Well done. We will also house the Hip Hop Archive and Research Institute under the direction of its creator, the irrepressible Marcy Morgan, down here. We have the Afro-Latin American Research Institute, run with enormous skill and commitment by Alejandro de la Fuente. 2 publications, the Du Bois Review, edited by the redoubtable Larry Bobo, and Transition Magazine, edited by the trio of Vince Brown, Glenda Carpio, and Tommy Shelby. Also proudly under our roof will be both the image of the Black Archive as well as the History Design Studio, the brainchild of our ever-busy Vince Brown. And our newest initiative is the Project for Race and Gender in Science and Medicine, guided by Evelyn Hammonds. And as you'll hear a bit later on, you put all these things together and you have by far the most important and largest and deepest pool of intellectual property in African and African American research in the world. And I'm very proud of that. The mission of the center is straightforward: to support research and this is very important because it's something important to our president, Drew Faust, interdisciplinary collaboration on the history and culture of people of African descent all over the world, as well as, and this is important to me, to promote public discussion and understanding on issues of class and race that too often divide us as a society. Now, another question I'm often asked is, where did the idea for the center come from? Well, Skip, I don't mind if I tell this story. More than a decade ago, I promised a donation to Harvard on the occasion of my 25th reunion. I'm sure that dates me a little bit now, saying that was a decade ago. At the time, I specified the amount, but I hadn't decided where I would direct the funds. It had occurred to me, though, that the work performed by Skip and his colleagues at the Du Bois Institute might be the right beneficiary, given both its vital importance to our society and the surprisingly limited resources available to African American studies around the country. So that summer on Martha's Vineyard, which we otherwise call Harvard in the summertime, I dropped by a symposium Skip was conducting at an old church in Edgartown called the Wailing Church to have a look. I hid in the back because I had come straight from the beach. I was in flip-flops, a damp bathing suit, and a pretty ratty t-shirt. But what I saw was, I was just so inspired by what I witnessed that I decided on the spot that I would direct my donation to Skip, and that with luck, it could lead to something of great importance in the future. So possessed with enthusiasm at the end of the symposium, I raced forward and informed Skip that I was going to give him my 25th reunion gift. The deeply skeptical look on his face soon reminded me of, shall we say, my bohemian appearance. Needless to say, I slunk away more than a little embarrassed. However, having been an investor for 3 decades, I can recognize a good investment when I see one. And I especially know not to let a great deal slip away because of something silly like a poor first impression. So I resolved to proceed. And as this video will now explain, the rest is history.
got this call from, a very angry call from a person in the development office. And I said hello, and he said, "How do you know Glenn Hutchins?" And I said, "I don't know Glenn Hutchins." He said, "Well, that can't be true because they just gave you a donation that had 6 zeros behind it."
Jesus spent his time among the poor and the disheveled.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And I was poor, and he was
Disheveled, yeah.
Glenn has since that time become the largest single donor in the history of the fields of African and African American studies. No one could ever have imagined that the Du Bois Institute would ever occupy a space in the middle of Harvard Square as magnificent as the new Hutchins Center.
African American studies was born in a period of great turmoil, and it was very difficult to make it prosper.
The department was founded in 1969 out of student protest. Black studies on campuses was the call of students of my generation.
Getting Skip Gates to come here was transformational.
When I was hired in 1991, I inherited a fellows program. They didn't have very gracious digs.
It was literally in the basement of the freshman dorm. From the very beginning, they understood the need for a place for scholars to convene.
I asked Skip if he would draw up a list of names of people he wanted to recruit, and we sat down and decided that we would go for it. And once that happened, we created a kind of momentum that was very, very hard to stop.
Skip came to Harvard with a vision, and that was there were to be no boundaries between Africa and the Americas.
African and African American questions are at the core of world history and world identity, as well as U.S. history and U.S. identity.
The last several centuries has been the kind of view of Africa as this continent that's made little or no contribution to the march forward of mankind. And this is one of the places correcting the deep error in that assumption.
Our goal was to be the center of intellection for the sophisticated examination of the black world throughout the diaspora, both from various social science disciplines as well as different humanistic approaches. And having them all at one place implicitly creates interdisciplinarity.
Very often the greatest progress comes at the boundary between disciplines, and that's what interdisciplinary research is all about, and that's what centers like the Hutchins Center are all about.
What's unique and interesting about this gift is really the involvement of the giver. Glenn is providing intellectual energy. New ideas are popping up in his head all the time.
Glenn has had a strong sense that a great institution, to remain great, has to change, has to keep pace with the world, and has to remain vibrant.
Most donors give what we call goodbye money, not hello money. Skip and his colleagues had made me an intellectual partner with them, and that is very, very gratifying. What we're going to be able to do is bring more of the great scholars in the world together.
Interdisciplinary research is extremely important, but it's also hard to do.
Departments, for example, become quite rigid. Centers are where we actually are able to do cross-disciplinary research.
A center not only promotes original academic research, but it creates a sense of community.
One of the great opportunities created by the Hutchins Center is a physical space where they can interact on a daily basis, where they can work together, where they can socialize, where they can have an identity.
Bring faculty and students together across fields and enable them to move outside of their disciplinary homes to address something that's of concern beyond the nature and inquiries of their particular discipline.
This moment at the Hutchins Center is what those in hip-hop call the next phase. This is who we are, this is what we do, and we're going to be doing this.
Stimulating, dynamic, intellectual interaction.
You can't get at any important culture as complex as African American experience without many different lenses coming together.
If you take the individual scholars, the programs, each of those individually are best in the field at what they do. When brought together in the Hutchins Center, that will create a combustible mixture from which I think huge ideas will explode.
That's why I wanted the center. I wanted all of these entities housed in one place.
There are so many creative people who are connected with the Hutchins Center.
What Glenn has been very good at is helping us to think more creatively about how we do fundraising. This is something where if we put some money, we can have a real impact.
Americans think of the challenges and problems of Africa without recognizing the enormous opportunities of Africa. Africa's been playing an increasingly important part in the global community and the global economy.
If you want to have people give you some insight into thinking about key policy questions, be they about the dynamics of race here in the U.S., affirmative action in Brazil, how you get to equity in South Africa, the Hutchins Center is the place that you start asking first for guidance and leadership.
No place will be more central, more fundamental to the conversation about race throughout the 21st century than the Hutchins Center at Harvard University.
Of the training of black men. The function of the Negro College is clear. It must maintain the standards of popular education. It must seek the social regeneration of the Negro. It must help in the solution of problems of race contact and cooperation. And finally, beyond all this, it must develop men above our modern socialism and out of the worship of the mass, must persist and evolve that higher individualism which is the center of culture, which the centers of culture protect. There must come a loftier respect for the sovereign human soul that seeks to know itself and the world about it, that seeks a freedom for expansion and self-development, that will love and hate and labor in its own way, untrammeled alike by old and new. Herein the longing of black men must have respect, the rich and bitter depth of their experience, the unknown treasures of their inner life, the strange rendings of nature they have seen, may give the world new points of view and make their loving, living, and doing precious to all human hearts. And to themselves in these, the days that try their souls, the chance to soar in the dim blue air above the smoke is to their finer spirits boon and guerdon for what they lose on earth by being black. I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension. So, wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into the dull, red hideousness of Georgia? Are you so afraid lest, peering from this high Pisgah between Philistine and Amalekite, we sight the promised land? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deval Patrick, and for some of you, I'm your governor. I'm proud to be here this afternoon to present the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal to Valerie Jarrett. Valerie could not be here today for reasons those of you who read the papers or watch the news will know, and those of you who don't should. There is an insurgency underway in Washington, and she is there dealing with that. But I am pleased to be here to present this award in absentia in the presence of our fabulous Harvard University president, Madam Justice, the other honorees, and my generous friend Glenn. Valerie Jarrett has dedicated herself, and by the way, I was sitting next to your mother when all these nice things were said about you, and the expression of pride and surprise on her face. It was really quite marvelous. Valerie Jarrett has dedicated herself to the idea that hard work and intellectual rigor can create better lives. She shares the value that we all have a stake in our neighbors' dreams and struggles as well as our own. A graduate of Stanford University and the University of Michigan Law School, she is, of course, now senior advisor to President Barack Obama, for whom she oversees the offices of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs and chairs the White House Council on Women and Girls. She has held positions in both the private and public sectors and has been a fixture in the civic life of Chicago, serving as chairman of the Chicago Transit Board, the commissioner of planning and development for the city of Chicago, and deputy chief of staff for former mayor Richard M. Daley, among a number of other positions. A passionate advocate of improving access and opportunity for all Americans, Valerie Jarrett has played a key role in President Obama's domestic agenda, including the Recovery Act, the Race to the Top education competition, and the Affordable Care Act. All of these programs are aimed at broadening opportunity in education, employment, and health care. As part of the President's vision of creating real and lasting change. Throughout her years of public service, Valerie Jarrett has been a fearless trailblazer of unmatched conviction and grace. And I am humbled and honored to present in absentia her with the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal. She has prepared a note, very briefly, which Skip has asked me to read. And she writes, "It is a tremendous honor for me to receive the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal. I am truly humbled to join such a distinguished group of recipients, both past and present. Please offer my heartfelt congratulations to the other honorees who will be with you. As you can also imagine, I was certainly looking forward to being on Harvard's campus with so many amazing young people," and she adds, "outside of the madness of Washington, D.C. I will treasure this recognition and pledge to earn it each day by promoting equality of access to opportunity for all. All the best, Valerie."
For her lifelong service to the people of Chicago and to the people of her country, and for her continually working to ensure that the least among us are not left behind, the Du Bois Medal is given in absentia to Valerie Jarrett.
Good afternoon. I am Diane Paulus, Artistic Director of the American Repertory Theater at Harvard University. And I am deeply honored to have been invited by my friend Skip Gates to present the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal to Tony Kushner. Tony is, without question, one of the most important forces in contemporary American theater. There is no other playwright working today who approaches the issues of identity, progress, and humanity with the wild imagination and deep, deep compassion that Tony Kushner brings to them. In a recent interview Tony did with the Transition magazine, a publication of the Hutchins Center, I should add, the author of the piece wrote that Kushner's ability to imagine complex and sometimes unbearable human experience sits at the heart of his work as a playwright, screenwriter, and political activist. The evidence of this ability is visceral in all of his work. No one had seen anything like Angels in America, a gay fantasia on national themes, when the first part, Millennium Approaches, premiered in 1990, and the second part, Perestroika, followed in 1992. Both parts debuted on Broadway, directed by the great George C. Wolfe in 1993. Both challenged audiences to think and feel and fight and love. Tony always challenges himself as a writer and thinker, too, and his other plays, including A Bright Room Called Day, Slavs, Homebody Kabul, Caroline and Change, for which he wrote both book and lyrics, and The Intelligent Homosexual's Guide to Capitalism and Socialism with a Key to the Scriptures, are radically different works of art that are nonetheless united by his fierce intellect and his undying faith in people's ability to change and to be better citizens of the world. He has done a number of translations and adaptations, including the Yiddish drama, The Dybbuk, Mother Courage and Her Children, and Brundabar. And we can't overlook his brilliant, provocative, and challenging screenplays for Mike Nichols' adaptation of Angels in America, and of course, for Steven Spielberg's Munich and Lincoln. Tony Kushner has won every major award there is for a playwright. The Pulitzer Prize for Drama, 2 Tonys, an Emmy, 3 Obies, and several awards for his work as a humanitarian and political activist. Both Munich and Lincoln received Oscar nominations for Best Adapted Screenplay. In 2013, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Medal of Arts and Humanities. Tony Kushner's faith in change and progress were perhaps developed as this New York-born gay Jewish boy grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Perhaps it is this formative outsider's perspective that has enabled him to go so deeply into his multivalenced characters. It was in Lake Charles that he saw what happens when an all-white high school changes, seemingly overnight, to one with perfect racial balance. In his school, at least, the result of integration 4 years later was a white prom king and a black prom queen. Change was not easy, but it happened, and it does in his masterworks of theater and film. It is indeed an honor to present Tony Kushner with a W.B. Du Bois Medal in recognition of his contributions to presenting life and history, American, African American, and everything else on stage and screen with honesty and conviction.
Beautiful. In his writing, as in his life, Tony Kushner is wedded to honesty, equality, and justice. The Du Bois Medal recognizes Tony Kushner's remarkable gift for fostering a humane dialogue that refuses to be limited by the boundaries set by race and class, gender, and sexuality. Tony Kushner. Congratulations. Proud of you.
I wasn't prepared to speak. It means everything to me to receive a medal named after one of my real heroes, W.E.B. Du Bois, and to get the news from another hero of mine, Skip Gates, to come to Harvard and to receive this in the presence of scholars like Professor Appia and Professor Patterson, whose work has changed my life and the way that I think about the world. So I'm deeply, deeply moved and incredibly happy and feel totally unworthy. And like Valerie, Jarrett, I will work very, very hard to earn this. Thank you very much.
I will read a passage from W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk chapter on the training of black men, published in 1903. 50 years ago, the ability of Negro students in any appreciable numbers to master a modern college course would have been difficult to prove. Today, it is proved by the fact that 400 Negroes, many of whom have been reported as brilliant students, have received the bachelor's degree from Harvard, Yale, Oberlin, and 70 other leading colleges. Here we have, then, nearly 2,500 Negro graduates, of whom the crucial query must be made: how far did their training fit them for life? It is, of course, extremely difficult to collect satisfactory data on such a point. Difficult to reach the men to get trustworthy testimony and to gauge that testimony by any generally acceptable criterion of success. In 1900, the conference at Atlanta University undertook to study these graduates and publish their results. First, they sought to know what these graduates were doing and succeeded in getting answers from nearly 2/3 of the living. The direct testimony was, in almost all cases, corroborated by the reports of the colleges where they graduated, so that, in the main, the reports were worthy of credence. 53% of these graduates were teachers, presidents of institutions, heads of normal schools, principals of city school systems, and the like. 17% were clergymen. Another 17% were in the professions, chiefly as physicians. Over 6% were merchants, farmers, and artisans, and 4% were in the government civil service. Granting, even that a considerable proportion of the third unheard from are unsuccessful, this is a record of usefulness. Personally, I know many hundreds of these graduates and have corresponded with more than 1,000. Through others, I have followed carefully the life work of scores. I have taught some of them and some of the pupils whom they have taught, lived in homes which they have built, and looked at life through their lives. Comparing them as a class with my fellow students in New England and Europe, I cannot hesitate in saying that nowhere have I met men and women with a broader spirit of helpfulness, with deeper devotion to their life work, or with more consecrated determination to succeed in the face of bitter difficulties than among Negro college-bred men. They have, to be sure, their proportion of ne'er-do-wells, their pedants and lettered fools, but they have a surprising small proportion of them. They have not that culture of manner which we instinctively associate with university men, forgetting that in reality it is a heritage from cultured homes, and that no people, a generation removed from slavery, can escape a certain unpleasant rawness and gaucherie despite the best of training. Thank you.
In that beautiful city. Thank you. It's nice to be here at Harvard. A few years ago, I used to send checks. My youngest child graduated from the law school here, and at her graduation day, she asked me to take pictures with her. So I turned my pockets inside out. So I am one of the highest honors I've received as a man was to talk about David Stern. After I left the Celtics, I didn't have much contact with the NBA. And when David became the commissioner, his first statement was, the Players Association are not my adversaries, they're my business partners. What David has facilitated is that he built a three-legged stool, management, labor, and consumers. And if either one of the three get out of whack, you have problems. And so over the years, since David has been commissioner, he's made a lot of money for the NBA. But that is not the agenda. The agenda is to be good citizens. And so to make a lot of money and not earn respect, nothing to it, because we're all human beings. And my relationship with David has been, for me, extraordinary. Because I participated in the NBA in the relatively early stages. I think my first year in the NBA, there were maybe a dozen black players. And when I left, the worm had turned. But when David became commissioner, there was a mentality in the NBA of the owners were plantation owners. And there was no respect between the players and the owners. I was in the locker room when we voted to strike the All-Star game here in Boston. The 20 top players in the league said we would like to be recognized as an association. And the owner said, to hell with you. When David became commissioner, the first thing he said were, they are my business partners. And he has skillfully negotiated the three legs of the stool to make the NBA very successful, not just in money. He's made it a worldwide experience. That in 1959, I went to all over Africa doing basketball clinics. And since then, I've gone all over China, all over South America, all over Central America, and all over Europe. because I wanted to do whatever I could to help David in his agenda. And he has been marvelous for me to work with. You know, you hear all kinds of stories about people, and one of the ones I used to hear was the NBA officers are real fancy, and David, as head guy in charge, he'd go around and talk to the people to find out what's going on in the offices. And so one day he was at the coffee machine, and there was an intern there. And they were making coffee and having a conversation. And David asked the intern, "What do you do?" "Well, I'm an intern here, and I'm having a good time. I'm enjoying this." And who are you? He says, "I'm David Stern." And the intern says, "What does David Stern do?" And David said, "I fire people that don't know who David Stern is." Now, David has, over the years, done some marvelous things for basketball. It is the most successful of the leagues in terms of the player-management relationship, but also we do enormous amount of community service. For example, one of the things I participated in was rebuilding houses in New Orleans after Katrina. And this year, I went back to my old high school, and we built a library and learning center. And the NBA does that in every city, even in some cities that don't have basketball teams. And it is a real pleasure for me, and an honor, to be able to introduce David Stern, who has been a commissioner for years and years, but he's been a man with a commitment to community service. And it's just not enough to just make money. That's always nice. But to be an asset to your community. And David has worked with great effort to make sure that happens at every franchise, and even in places that have no franchises. With the NBA, as one of the ambassadors, I visited. The first visit I made was to Athens, Greece. I've been to Beijing, Hong Kong, Shanghai, London, Paris, Madrid, all over the world, so that when you go to a game, you are seeing the best players in the world in that sport. And that's one of the things that David has brought about. And the best thing you can say about business partners, we are friends. And it gave me great pleasure to introduce and to give David this award. Seriously enough, he deserves it.
David Stern has brought his love of the game of basketball to millions of fans around the country and now around the world. In the course of doing so, he has demonstrated that achievement and acumen have no race. For this, we recognize David Stern with the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal.
Bill, why do I feel I need a rebuttal? That's one of the great honors to be introduced by Bill Russell for me. I just want to say that in recognizing me, I think the Institute is recognizing the importance and possibilities inherent in sports. We came from a sport where Bill Russell could not eat and sleep with his teammates in certain cities when he was playing, so sports reflects society. And yet I always felt to mention a team in another city, that any sport where somebody from Louisiana and Grambling, like Willis Reed, and Jefferson City and Princeton, like Bill Bradley, could play on a team, demonstrated that it's about your talent and your ability. And like so many other examples, it leads to enormous opportunities, some reflective in education and some reflective even in politics and government. But sports has an enormous opportunity to play in that. And in recognizing me, you're really recognizing the power of sports, my colleagues at the NBA, and the thousands of players that I've had the pleasure to see play while I've been associated with the NBA. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Martha Minow, and I am the Dean of the Harvard Law School. I taught a man named Barack Obama, and Barack Obama appointed Sonia Sotomayor to be Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I was thrilled when my friend Skip invited me to introduce this award to Sonia from the Bronx. Although now we call her Justice Sotomayor. Her parents came to New York from Puerto Rico. She grew up, okay, go on. She grew up with 2 languages and forged a life connecting the contrasting worlds of public housing and working-class New York, Princeton and Yale universities, New York criminal justice, private law firm practice, civic advocacy with the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. She lost her father to alcoholism, her grandmother to ovarian cancer, a cousin to drugs and AIDS. She has managed her diabetes. She cherishes the family gatherings and the drive to succeed she learned from her mother and extended family in Puerto Rico and her broader community. Shocked by a C grade on a paper in college, she immersed in English grammar and vocabulary, ultimately winning prizes for her writing and graduating summa cum laude from Princeton University. Her devotion to ensuring opportunities for others is legendary. At college, she pressed for more opportunities for students from Puerto Rico. She urged diversification of faculty hiring and the curriculum. She worked with children in after-school programs and volunteered as an interpreter for Latino patients at a psychiatric hospital. At law school, she chaired a group of Latin American, Asian, and Native American students, and she pushed for diversifying hiring there too, even as she authored a landmark publication on how Puerto Rico's statehood would affect mineral and ocean rights. Like the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center, she became an expert in the lives of Latino members of this nation. And like the Hutchins Center, she has pursued uncompromising excellence with a big heart. As a judge, appointed to the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York by a Republican president, and to the Federal Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court by Democratic presidents, she is intellectually demanding. She is also the judge, the justice, who knows all the cafeteria workers, the janitors, by name, their families, their lives. She is the judge who saved baseball with her 1994 ruling ending the strike and halting the use of replacement players. She has pitched to the Yankees. She has explained what a judge does and what a career is on Sesame Street. She meets now with people in communities all over the country to demystify law, and she pursues justice every day. In her own words, "I strive never to forget the real-world consequences of my decisions on individuals, businesses, and governments." She also has said, "You are not born anything. Practice makes perfect." Her story is a testament to the triumph of brains and hard work over circumstance, of a childhood dream realized through extraordinary will and dedication. She chose to tell her story in a beautifully written, compelling book, My Beloved World, Mi Mundo Adorado, offered simultaneously in English and Spanish. The selection committee for this splendid W.E.B. Du Bois Medal says, by exploring the personal histories and professional paths of individuals such as Sonia Sotomayor, we come to understand how American history has evolved and how it continues to evolve. I add, by looking to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, my classmate, my friend, my hero, we come to understand the stunning wisdom, spirit, kindness, intelligence, and mastery of the multiple languages of this great country.
Congratulations. A champion of equal opportunity and equal justice for all, Sonia Sotomayor draws from the rich well of her experience to render decisions with insight and wisdom. She serves as a reminder that country, class, and color should never be barriers to achievement. The W.E.B. Du Bois Medal recognizes Sonia Sotomayor for her splendid embodiment of Veritas.
Congratulations.
Well, there's one lesson that everyone in this room should learn. Always hire a friend to give your introductions. Thank you, Martha. You know, I receive awards like this, and I'm so deeply humbled. Humbled because I'm included in the company of co-honorees who have done such extraordinary things in their lives. Humbled because I'm being given an award by a school, a department, and people who I so greatly admire in their own endeavors. And I am always reminded and continue to remember that I never stand alone, because I do stand on the shoulders of all those men and women that Skip spoke about earlier, on the shoulders of so many people in this room and everybody who preceded me to open the door of opportunity for me. And I try to remember that paying forward is an obligation that I must not only undertake, but that gives meaning to all our lives. Glenn and everyone here who is still paying forward, thank you for this award.
I shall read from The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois's words on a man who was his hero, on Alexander Crummell. So the man groped for light. All this was not life. It was the world wandering of a soul in search of itself, the striving of one who vainly sought his place in the world, ever haunted by the shadow of a death that is more than death, the passing of a soul that has missed its duty. 20 years he wandered, 20 years and more, and yet the hard, rasping question kept gnawing within him. What in God's name am I on earth for? In the narrow New York parish, his soul seemed cramped and smothered. In the fine old air of the English university, he heard the millions wailing over the sea. In the wild, fever-cursed swamps of West Africa, he stood helpless and alone. The valley of the shadow of death gives few of its pilgrims back to the world, but Alexander Crummell it gave back. Out of the temptation of hate and burned by the fire of desire, triumphant over doubt and steeled by sacrifice against humiliation, he turned at last home across the waters, humble and strong, gentle and determined. He never faltered, he seldom complained. He simply worked, inspiring the young, rebuking the old, helping the weak, guiding the strong. So he grew and brought within his wide influence all that was best of those who walk within the veil. They who live without knew not nor dreamed of that full power within, that mighty inspiration which the dull gauze of caste decreed that most men should not know. And now that he is gone, I sweep the veil away and cry, lo, the soul to whose dear memory I bring this little tribute. I can still see his face, dark and heavy-lined beneath his snowy hair, lighting and shading now with inspiration for the future, now in innocent pain at some human wickedness, now with sorrow at some hard memory from the past. The more I met Alexander Crummell, the more I felt how much that world was losing which knew so little of him. In another age, he might have sat among the elders of the land, in purple bordered toga. In another country, mothers might have sung him to the cradles. He did his work. He did it nobly and well. And yet I sorrow that he worked alone here with so little human sympathy. His name today in this broad land means little and comes to 50 million ears laden with no incense of memory or emulation. And herein lies the tragedy of the age. Not that men are poor. All men know something of poverty. Not that men are wicked. Who is good? Not that men are ignorant. What is truth? Nay, but that men know so little of men. Thank you.
W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression." It's my distinct privilege to celebrate the Honorable John Lewis, a man who has lived his life according to Du Bois's credo. John Lewis's leadership in the civil rights movement changed America for the better and forever. He has been a lifelong inspiration for me and for generations of Americans. Let me try to distill the life and accomplishments of one of America's iconic figures. Born the son of Alabama sharecroppers in 1940, John Lewis grew up on his family's farm and attended where his family were sharecroppers, on their farm, and attended segregated public schools. As a young boy, he was inspired by Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, as well as the words of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., which he heard on the radio. For you young folks in the audience today, the radio then was sort of like Facebook today. While a student at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, John organized sit-in demonstrations which led to the desegregation of the city's lunch counters. This is where he was introduced to both the philosophy and practice of nonviolent protest as a means to promote civil rights, justice, and reconciliation. In 1961, he was one of the first 13 freedom riders, 6 blacks and 7 whites, who rode buses from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans as a racially integrated group to challenge the Jim Crow laws, which strictly enforced segregation at bus terminals across the South, a practice which had been outlawed by the Supreme Court, but was still widespread in the South. By simply sitting in the seats reserved for whites, John Lewis risked his life many times on those rides and was often beaten, arrested, and jailed. In one horrific incident in Alabama, his bus was firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan. In Birmingham and Montgomery, he was beaten severely by angry mobs and left for dead. In Mississippi, he was arrested and thrown not in jail, but into prison for 40 days. Undeterred, the Freedom Riders finished their ride and changed America forever. In 1963, Lewis, who by the age of 23 had been arrested 24 times, was named chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which organized student activism, including boycotts, sit-ins, marches, and all manner of nonviolent protest. As one of the big 6 leaders of the civil rights movement, together with Whitney Young, A. Philip Randolph, James Farmer, Roy Wilkins, and of course Martin Luther King Jr., John was an architect of the 1963 March on Washington, which featured Dr. King's historic I Have a Dream speech. John was the youngest speaker that day and is now the only living speaker. My mother, sitting right here in the front row next to our governor and my college classmate, attended the 1963 March on Washington as a 43-year-old woman from Virginia. Last summer, She insisted, didn't ask, insisted that Skip and I take her at age 93 to Washington for the 50th anniversary where John spoke again. In 1964, John Lewis coordinated SNCC's engagement in the Mississippi Freedom Summer, a campaign to involve college students from across the country on summer break to help register blacks to vote in Mississippi, the most deeply segregated state in the country. During that summer's campaign, the Ku Klux Klan, working in collaboration with the local police, beat and killed numerous civil rights workers, including most notoriously James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. After much protest and long delay, the murderers were brought to justice, marking the first time since Reconstruction that white men were convicted of a civil rights violation in Mississippi. In 1965, Lewis helped spearhead one of the seminal moments in the history of the civil rights movement. On March 7, a day now known as Bloody Sunday, John Lewis and Hosea Williams led over 600 peaceful, orderly protesters across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to demonstrate the need for voting rights in that state. At the end of the bridge, they were met by the police who, when the marchers stopped to pray, brutally attacked them with tear gas, dogs, and clubs. John's skull was fractured that day, and the scars are still visible today. News broadcasts and photographs depicting for the whole nation to see the senseless cruelty of local officials in the South helped hasten the passage of the Voting Rights Act later that year. Once again, John's quiet determination, disciplined adherence to nonviolence, and heroic leadership had changed America for the better. Despite more than 40 arrests, physical attacks, and serious injuries, John remained a devoted advocate of the philosophy of nonviolence. He next turned the focus of his life struggle for rights and justice to politics. Today, after leaving SNCC, he became the director of the Voting Education Project, which transformed the politics of the South by adding nearly 4 million unregistered voters to the rolls. Today, blacks serve in elective offices all across the South, in no small measure due to John's labors. In 1981, he was elected to the Atlanta City Council, where he was an advocate for ethics in government and neighborhood preservation. In 1986, he was elected to represent the city of Atlanta in the U.S. Congress. Once again, he assumed a leadership role, and in the House today, he is known as, quote, the conscience of the Congress. And I'm sure he's there giving them hell today. John Lewis holds a BA degree in religion and philosophy from Fisk and is a graduate of the American Baptist Theological Seminary. He's the recipient of Harvard's highest honor, together with Bill Russell in the front row here, a Doctor of Laws from Harvard, and our nation's highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom. Often called one of the most courageous persons the civil rights movement ever produced, John Lewis has dedicated his life to nonviolence, protecting human rights, securing civil liberties, and building what he calls, quote, the beloved community, quote, in America. He is a genuine American hero. It is our distinct honor today to award him, in absentia, the Du Bois Medal. You want to come say something?
Lion of the civil rights movement and selfless public servant, John Lewis has never rested in the fight for equal opportunity and social justice for all Americans, regardless of color or creed. It's with the greatest respect and reverence that we present him with the Du Bois Medal. Let's give it up for John Lewis.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Skip and Glenn for this extraordinary day, but for all the days to come for the Hutchins Center and what it's going to mean for Harvard and for the world, and for all of the students and faculty who are going to be engaged with it in the future. We are so grateful for your efforts and for what it's going to mean for all of us. Thank you. When he was inaugurated in 2007 as the first African-American governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick took the oath of office on the Mendy Bible. As you may know, this Bible was given to former President John Quincy Adams in 1841 by a group of Africans from the slave ship Amistad who had mutinied to prevent themselves from being sold into bondage in the American South. Adams had just successfully argued for their freedom before the U.S. Supreme Court. As Governor Patrick recalled this history in his speech, he referred to the story of the Amistad as not just a black man's journey, but an American journey. Steven Spielberg recognized when he created his film Amistad that the struggle for freedom that reached from the shores of Africa to the chambers of the United States Supreme Court was not just a black man's story, but an American story and a powerfully human story. For nearly 4 decades, we have journeyed with Steven Spielberg as he has told us stories that have shaped our lives. Sometimes that journey has been through the churning waters of our national history, as with Amistad or his recent masterpiece, Lincoln. Sometimes we have journeyed through the European battlegrounds of Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, and Munich. And at other times, through realms of fantasy and adventure that are no less real for all that they are imaginary, as in E.T., Indiana Jones movies, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. By any measure, one of the most successful filmmakers of all time, Spielberg has infused each of his movies with the same guiding principle. It is a principle that guides his philosophy of life as well. As he said recently, profound changes can occur when one person makes a positive choice. It is this thread that we see running through his work as a director in films that include the blockbusters Jaws and Jurassic Park, the thought-provoking and atmospheric The Color Purple, Empire of the Sun, and War Horse, and the eerily otherworldly War of the Worlds, Minority Report, and AI, Artificial Intelligence. As a producer, too, through Amblin Entertainment and now through DreamWorks, he has brought this sensibility through both comedy and drama to countless commercial and critical film successes, including Men in Black, American Beauty, and A Beautiful Mind. And of course, he's worked in television as well, including 2 acclaimed HBO miniseries co-produced with Tom Hanks, Band of Brothers and The Pacific. Spielberg has won 3 Oscars for Best Director and Best Picture for Schindler's List and Best Director for Saving Private Ryan. He's been recognized numerous times by critics groups as well as by his fellow directors and producers, with Golden Globe Awards and Producers Guild of America and Directors Guild of America awards. In 1995, he won the 23rd AFI Life Achievement Award. In their citation for that honor, the trustees of the American Film Institute wrote that his film's images and ideas of hope, beauty, excitement, and nobility speak to the best that is in us. In addition to his work in film, Steven Spielberg has dedicated his time and resources to philanthropic endeavors. He is the chairman emeritus of the Starlight Children's Foundation, which he founded to support family activities and education for seriously ill children. He established the Righteous Persons Foundation with resources from Schindler's List to promote social justice and educational exchange efforts within and beyond the Jewish community. He founded the USC Shoah Foundation, the Institute for Visual History and Education, with the goal of interviewing and recording the testimonies of survivors and of witnesses to the Holocaust and other genocides. Indeed, profound changes can occur when one person makes a positive choice. We are honored today to honor one such person for bringing us stories of Africans and African Americans and stories of struggles for freedom and justice that bond all of us in a common humanity. It is my great privilege to present Steven Spielberg with the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal.
Every story he has told has at its heart the great power that comes from one person making one decision that can bring positive change to the life of another or to the lives of countless others. In both his films and his philanthropy, Steven Spielberg envisions worlds in which women and men are, to borrow a famous phrase, judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, for inviting us to see worlds in which differences are enriching rather than damning. We present this Du Bois Medal to Steven Spielberg. Congratulations.
Thank you. When Lincoln was just about to come out and the reviews were coming in, and they were good reviews, and the only thing I cared about was, what does Skip Gates think of my movie? And I was very relieved when Tony Kushner called me on the phone and he said he really liked it. So I got my first good night's sleep in weeks after that. Thank you very much. This is indeed just an incredible honor, and this is a laurel upon which I promise not to rest, but instead to keep moving uphill, because nothing gets done unless we're all going uphill. And when we get to the top, maybe then I'll look down and I'll say, well, I earned it then. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to read an excerpt from W.E.B. Du Bois's essay, A Negro Student at Harvard at the End of the 19th Century, published in the Massachusetts Review. I went to Harvard as a Negro, not simply by birth, but recognizing myself as a member of a segregated caste whose situation I accepted. But I was determined to work from within that caste to find my way out. I did not pick out SNAP courses. I was there to enlarge my grasp of the meaning of the universe. I did not find better teachers at Harvard, but teachers better known who had wider facilities for gaining knowledge and lived in a broader atmosphere for approaching truth. Eventually, in mass assault led by culture, we Negroes were going to break down the boundaries of race. But at present, we were banded together in a great crusade, and happily so. Sometimes the shadow of insult fell, as when at one reception, as Skip noted, a white woman seemed determined to mistake me for a waiter. In general, I was encased in a completely colored world, self-sufficient and provincial, and ignoring, just as far as possible, the white world which conditioned it. This was self-protective coloration, with perhaps an inferiority complex, but with belief in the ability and future of black folk. This cutting of myself off from my white fellows, or being cut off, did not mean unhappiness or resentment. I was in my early manhood, unusually full of high spirits and humor. I thoroughly enjoyed life. I was conscious of understanding and power, and conceited enough still to imagine, as in high school, that they who did not know me were the losers, not I. On the other hand, I do not think that my white classmates found me personally objectionable. I was clean, not well-dressed, but decently clothed. Manners I regarded as more or less superfluous and deliberately cultivated a certain brusquerie. Personal endowment I regarded as pleasant, but not important. I was in Harvard, but not of it, and realized all the irony of my singing Fair Harvard. I sang it because I liked the music, and not from any pride in the Pilgrims. In June 1890, I received my bachelor's degree from Harvard cum laude in philosophy. I knew by this time that practically my sole chance of earning a living combined with study was to teach. And after my work in United States history, I conceived the idea of applying philosophy to an historical interpretation of race relations. In other words, I was trying to take my first steps toward sociology as the science of human action. I was confident. So far I had met no failure. I willed, and lo, I was walking beneath the elms of Harvard, the name of allurement, the college of my youngest, wildest visions. I needed money. Scholarships and prizes fell into my lap. Not all that I wanted or strove for, but all I needed to keep me in school. Commencement came, and standing before governor, president, and grave-gowned men, I told them certain truths, waving my arms and breathing fast. They applauded with what may have seemed to many as uncalled-for fervor, but I walked home on pink clouds of glory. Thank you.
I'm Jonathan Walton, and I've sat here for the past couple of hours and realized that I am the least significant African American on this campus. And actually, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing because it's a tribute to what Harvard has produced. It's a tribute to what the Hutchins Center of African and African American Research will be in the future. That so many beautiful minds, Skip Gates, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, William Julius Wilson, Marcy Morgan, Marla Frederick, Tommy Shelby, the greatest minds on this campus have come here to extend knowledge, our ways of knowing, about Africans and African Americans. And for this, to Professor Gates, to Glenn Hutchins, to President Faust, we all say thank you. Professor Gates requested that we end with a posture of prayer, meditation, and sober reflection. And so therefore, we will conclude in the same way that we commenced, with a prayer for dark people from W.E.B. Du Bois. Forget not, O God, those who are homeless, those who are friendless. Let us not forget them. Lay their sorrows on our hearts as some slight atonement for our sin, and that your goodwill that you send to earth will not be simply for the good, for the accomplished, for the well cared for the successful, but may it be for all persons. Pity those who hurt, and pity us too if we have no sympathy for them, God. And encourage us in these halls to dedicate our lives to the lessening of their sorrow, the uprooting of their poverty, and the broadening of life and living so that all human souls may feel as honored, may feel as special as those we have come here to celebrate today. This is our prayer. This is our plea. May we all say together, amen. Amen. Now, beautiful people, will you please join me in once again saluting the 2013 recipients of the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal. On behalf of President Faust, on behalf of Glenn Hutchins and Professor Henry Louis Gates, we thank you all for sharing with us in this beautiful occasion for the launch of this Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. We thank you all for coming. And please now show your love for Brother Sheldon Reed and the Kuumba Singers, these wonderful students, as they sing the South African national anthem for us.
We'll actually be singing a standard of ours. It's our setting of Amazing Grace. Thank you so much.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious is that grace appear the hour I first 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. It was grace that lead me home. Oh, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we know last day to sing God's praise. Then when we first begun, then when we first it was amazing grace. Pass me not, O gentle Savior. Oh, it was His grace